Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We will now begin. Story 1. The Workday of a Royal Executioner. You awaken in a cold stone room, the smell of damp wood and iron filling your nose. Outside, a crow caws as the mist lifts slowly from the fields beyond the castle wall. It is morning in a 14th century English town, but this is no ordinary morning, and you are no ordinary man. You are the apprentice to the town executioner. The gallows were constructed yesterday in the square, timed with a market day for maximum attendance. It's a ritual that is both expected and dreaded. For a public hanging isn't just a punishment, it is theater, deterrent, and a grim spectacle of civic order. Becoming the executioner's apprentice. The path to this profession is not well trodden. Executioners are often social outcasts, feared and hated in equal measure. Many are born into the role's sons, inheriting the grisly tasks of their fathers. Others, like yourself, are chosen from the margins, criminals offered reprieve in exchange for service, or those with no other livelihood. No guild represents you. No priest blesses your tools. You are essential yet shunned. The community does not speak to you unless necessary. At market, you shop last. At church, you kneel at the back if you're allowed at all. Your master, a grim man named Thomas of Rye, has worked the scaffold for nearly 2 decades. His back is hunched, but his hands are steady. He speaks in few words, mostly instructions. Oil the blade, measure the rope, watch the wind. You've watched 5 executions so far. Today is the 6th, but today it will be your hand. Tools of the trade. Contrary to myth, most executioners in this era do not use swords or axes, especially not in English towns. That is reserved for nobility and special circumstances. The common sentence is hanging, performed from a basic wooden gallows, usually 2 upright beams with a crossbeam. The rope is hemp, coiled and boiled in wax to prevent fraying. It's been measured and cut depending on the prisoner's weight, with calculations scrawled in Latin on a piece of parchment, overseen by a city official. A botched hanging too short and the prisoner strangles slowly. Too long and the head may be ripped off is a sign of unprofessionalism, or divine punishment, or sabotage. In any case, it reflects poorly on you. For backup, you carry a small blade, not for show, for mercy. The role beyond killing. What most forget is that the executioner also plays the role of torturer, jailer, and even physician. You may be called to break bones, extract confessions under duress, or brand criminals. There are records of executioners tasked with flogging adulterers, amputating thieves' hands, or boiling counterfeiters in oil, though the latter is rare and mostly symbolic. You keep your tools in a locked chest. The branding iron, the cat-o'-nine tails, the bone saw, you clean them yourself. After each execution, the blood must be washed away from the square. It is often your task, or that of a designated cleaner from the poorhouse. You do not get paid much, but you do receive lodging and legal immunity from many common laws. You are not hanged for murder. You are the king's hand. The execution process. The prisoner, this time a horse thief named Robert of Loughborough, has been held in the jail for 2 weeks. His final confession was taken by the town priest yesterday. He is said to have stolen a destrier, worth more than many peasants make in 10 years. This morning, he will be walked from the jail to the scaffold, flanked by 2 guards. He will wear a simple tunic, barefoot, and carry no last meal, only the priest's prayers in his ears. A town crier will read the charges aloud. You will stand behind him, silent, face covered with a linen hood, not for drama, but to conceal your identity from potential vengeance. The crowd will cheer, some will spit, others will look away. And when the crier nods to you, you will do your duty. Living with the deed. What is often forgotten is what comes after. When the crowd disperses and the body is left to hang for hours, or in some cases, days, crows will descend if left unchecked. Eventually, you will be the one to cut the body down. You may even be asked to bury it. In some cases, criminals' bodies are not buried at all, but gibbeted, left in cages at crossroads to rot, as a warning to others. In these cases, you must clean and dress the corpse to prevent early decomposition, a macabre form of preservation. There is no ceremony, no thanks. You will return to your quarters and sleep if sleep comes. And tomorrow, you will sharpen the tools again. But how does one keep their humanity in a role so steeped in death? What becomes of an apprentice executioner who performs his task too well? As dawn gives way to a bleak morning sun, and the body of Robert of Loughborough swings gently from the gallows, your work is not yet complete. This was your first execution. You performed it cleanly. There was no botch, no twitching feet or snapping neck too sudden. The crier noted your precision. The priest muttered a blessing, though not to you. The crowd murmured their satisfaction before moving on to haggle over turnips and salted fish in the same square where a man had died minutes before. This is the rhythm of life in the medieval town. Justice and commerce entwined like vines on the crumbling stone of a market wall. But what becomes of the executioner once the ropes are packed away? The legal ghost. As the new apprentice, your presence is noted in town, but not in any official way. You are, in legal terms, liminal, neither fully a citizen nor fully outcast. This gray zone has its advantages. You may travel unbothered by tolls on certain roads. In disputes, the word of an executioner is rarely challenged. No one wants to cross you. But the isolation is real. You are legally banned from certain guild meetings. Bakers won't sell you bread unless you wait until they are nearly closed. Children are taught to avoid you. Dogs bark when you pass. You sleep in a small annex of the jail, a stone room with straw on the floor and a water barrel near the door. No one else uses the latrine you use. Even your master, Thomas of Rye, eats separately from you. His rules are simple. Keep your tools clean, your mind clear, and never speak of a job outside the execution field. Gossip is dangerous. Mercy is worse. The executioner's code. There is no written code, no charter or royal directive that outlines your duties. But there are customs centuries old, and they carry more weight than parchment. Never speak the condemned's name after death. Never perform a hanging drunk. Never take coin to lessen the rope's drop. Never deny the condemned a prayer. These are not laws. They are unwritten ethics passed from master to apprentice, guarding not morality but professional dignity. You are not a butcher. You are the king's appointed hand, and hands do not flinch. Thomas tells you stories of those who failed to respect the code. One man, he says, took bribes to make hanging slower to increase the suffering. He died not from mob justice but from loneliness. Starved, cast out, found years later with a cracked noose around his own neck. The gallows, it seems, does not easily let go of its craftsmen. Rope, wood, and reputation. Executioners were often identified not just by their work, but by their smell. The constant boiling of hemp rope, the iron smell of blood, the ash from lime pits used to quicken decomposition, all of it clings to your clothes, your skin, your breath. No amount of washing removes it fully. This aroma becomes your signature. You begin to notice people stepping aside before you even speak. A wide berth is given in taverns, should you even bother to enter one. If you do, The innkeeper might serve you in a chipped mug reserved for your kind. Never ask for a meal with meat. You'll receive scraps less as punishment, more as ritual cleanliness. And yet, your reputation also affords you safety. Thieves do not rob the executioner. Cutpurses know better than to cross someone so well versed in bodily frailty. There is a legend in your town that a man who struck the hangman with a stone later fell ill and died after seeing Thomas in a dream. You aren't sure if it's true, but no one dares test it. An economy of death. There is a practical side to your work, one not often discussed. You are part of the local economy. Bodies once hanged or broken still hold value. Surgeons request access to corpses to study anatomy, a rare and controversial privilege. Tanners occasionally collect the skins of criminals, yes, truly for parchment, though this is mostly whispered about in cities, not country towns. Apothecaries pay small coins for the fat of the deceased, believing it useful in unguents and poultices. Grave diggers, often your only friends, offer beer for help moving stiff bodies. You are both executioner and middleman in the trade of the dead. Then there are the display parts, heads placed on spikes, hands nailed above the city gate. This, too, is your job. You must handle and arrange the parts cleanly. The townspeople may not thank you, but they will remember your skill if the pieces rot too quickly or fall. The anatomy of a routine hanging. By your third execution, the routine begins to settle into your bones. Preparation the night before, measure the drop, calculate neck length and rope coil, boil and dry the noose, visit the condemned if allowed, and check for illness or injuries that could interfere with the sentence. The day of, sharpen your blade, oil your tools, wear clean, undyed linen, a symbol of impartiality. The walk, escort the prisoner, keep quiet, never speak unless asked, always walk behind. The sentence, stand still, await the town crier's signal, pull the lever or kick the stool cleanly, watch the body for signs of error. Post-hanging duties, guard the body, prevent tampering or premature removal, assist with gibbeting or burial. It is dull, meticulous, but this is where the importance lies, not in the death but in the method. Justice is not only served, it is seen to be served properly. Dreams and the question of conscience. You begin to dream of the scaffold, but not of those you've hanged. You dream of the crowd silent, watching, always watching. Their faces blur, but the stares burn into your sleep like embers. Executioners are often thought to be heartless, immune to guilt, but the truth is subtler. You don't feel guilt for the job, you feel disconnection. The condemned may have confessed, they may have been innocent, you will never truly know. Your task is not to judge but to perform. And yet late at night, when the wind howls through the town and your tools hang silent on their pegs, you wonder, what if I stopped? What if I refused? But you already know the answer. Executioners who refuse the rope are often given the noose themselves. The king tolerates no hesitation. Injustice may fester in the courts, but on the scaffold, order must be absolute. A quiet power. Over time, you notice something else. People begin to speak to you differently. Guards lower their voices. Town officials defer to you just slightly. You do not hold official power, but you hold something subtler, certainty. You are the final step, the last act in the legal theater, a man with no court of appeal, and that power changes how others see you even if it isolates you. Thomas of Rye says it best one night as you clean the blade together. The priest offers redemption, the Lord offers law, but it is we who carry out their promises. Never forget that. A sudden twist. And then one day, a summons comes from the castle. A nobleman has been sentenced, an uncommon event. The accused is Sir Aldrich de Malling, once favored by the Duke, now charged with sedition. But nobles are not hanged like commoners. They are beheaded. And you, not Thomas, have been requested by name. This is no accident. You've heard the whispers. Your hangings have been too precise, too clean. You are gaining a reputation for professionalism, a dangerous thing in a world that thrives on hierarchy and tradition. Why would a noble ask for you, a low-born apprentice? And what happens if you fail, if your blade hesitates, or worse, if you succeed too well? Could this request be a test, or perhaps a trap in a game far above your station? The letter from the castle is sealed in red wax, bearing the mark of Duke Renard's chancellery. You break it with trembling hands and unusual feeling, considering what you've done so far. It is a formal summons. You are to travel to the ducal keep by horse 3 days hence to carry out the execution of Sir Aldrich de Malin, Knight of the Marches, condemned for treason and plotting against the crown. He has chosen the sword, as is his right by birth. And he has chosen you to do it. Your master, Thomas of Rye, reads the letter in silence. His brow furrows deeper than you've ever seen. After a long pause, he speaks, almost gently. You must take my sword. A different kind of death. Unlike the scaffold, the execution by sword is a ritual almost sacred. Reserved for nobles, knights, and high clergy, it demands decorum, skill, and poise. The executioner must be precise. 1 clean stroke, 2 at most. If 3 are needed, it is a disgrace. The sword Thomas hands you is old but well kept. It has a long, broad blade, heavier than your noose or knife. The handle is wrapped in oxhide, the pommel engraved with an iron cross. This sword has beheaded lords, ladies, and bishops, each death etched silently in the scabbard's wear. Thomas spends the next 2 nights drilling you, not with words but with movements. He teaches you how to stand, how to swing with gravity, not strength, how to aim not at the neck but slightly below the ear, where the spine meets the base of the skull. He says little else. Arrival at the castle. The keep looms gray and square, rising from the forest like a slab of history. You are escorted in silence, not through the servants' passage, but the side gate usually reserved for scribes and lawyers. This is not an insult, it is ceremony. Everyone in the castle knows why you're here. You are lodged in a small room near the chapel. Bread and ale are brought twice a day. You are not permitted to speak to the prisoner. A steward delivers the final instructions. The execution will be in the inner courtyard before an audience of no more than 20 nobles. The Duke himself will preside. No crier will read the charges. Only the steward will speak. You will stand behind a black cloth screen until summoned. This is not theater, this is cleansing. The morning of the execution. At dawn, the chapel bells toll not for mass but for judgment. You dress in black linen as instructed. No hood. Nobles must see the face of their fate. The sword is already laid out on a table beside the gallows post. There will be no platform, only a wooden block. Sir Aldrich will kneel before it. The sky is overcast. Cold mist clings to the flagstones. You are calm, and yet your hands twitch slightly, not from fear but from something harder to name. Anticipation, perhaps, or a strange sense of finality. This, you realize, is not just an execution. It is a message. Sir Aldrich's final moments. He enters with grace, dressed in a simple white tunic. No armor, no shoes. A silver cross dangles from his neck. He is older than you imagined, perhaps 50, with a graying beard and blue eyes that scan the courtyard not nervously but with curiosity. He walks unaided. The steward reads the sentence with clipped finality. No charges, no testimony, simply. For crimes against the crown, for betrayal of sacred oaths, and for fomenting rebellion, Sir Aldrich de Malin is to be executed by the sword. A silence falls. Aldrich kneels. Then, before placing his head on the block, he turns not to you, but to the Duke. You may silence me, Renard, but you will never silence the cause. No one responds. He lowers his head. The blade falls. You step forward, The world narrows. You raise the sword. The weight is not in your arms, but in the eyes watching you, eyes of nobles, knights, stewards, and perhaps future traitors. The Duke's expression is unreadable. You exhale once, swing cleanly, and feel the dull shock as blade meets flesh. One stroke. The head falls, blood fountains, a silence thicker than stone follows. No cheer, no priest. Only the scrape of the block as the body is removed. You are dismissed without a word. What you learn in the days after. You stay in the keep one more night. There is no celebration, no reward. A small pouch of silver is placed under your door. But that evening, the steward visits. He speaks not as an officer of the court, but as a man in confidence. He chose you to remind the others, he says. A clean death, no spectacle, just inevitability. You understand. Sir Aldrich was not trying to avoid pain. He was trying to control the message. Your reputation as precise, dispassionate, professional, these were not threats to power but tools of it. By choosing you, Aldrich forced the court to look his death squarely in the face. No cruelty, no fumbles, just justice, however unjust. He died on his terms. The executioner's curse. You return to your town changed. The people no longer step aside. They avoid you altogether. Children hide. Merchants close their shutters. You have become something rarer now, not just a man with rope and blade, but a man who has killed nobility. A man who has crossed the threshold of class and come back alive. Thomas greets you with a nod. You did it clean, he says. That's what they'll remember, and that's what they'll fear. You ask him what happens next. He shrugs. They'll call you again, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll remember the man who made a noble's head fall without a scream. He turns away, then pauses. Careful, precision is a dangerous kind of fame. Years later. You are the executioner now. Thomas has passed. His tools are yours. His stories too. You've performed hangings, brandings, amputations, and twice more beheadings. The people never love you, but they respect the silence you carry, the steadiness of your work. And then one winter morning a rider comes. Another summons, another noble, another rebellion. The sword waits in its box, oiled, sharp, inevitable. You realize then, your profession is not just death, it is reminder. A reminder that justice, fair or cruel, always needs a face to wear the mask. The medieval executioner's life was never glorious. It was thankless, brutal, and profoundly lonely. But it was necessary in a society obsessed with order and visibility, where the manner of a person's death said more about power than truth. What began as a marginalized trade evolved into an instrument of statecraft. Each drop of blood, each clean beheading, was a sentence punctuating the king's law. But what happens when the executioner begins to question not the sentence, but the system itself? Story 2. Community policing in early England. It is the year 1182. You live in a modest village on the edge of Nottinghamshire, surrounded by low thatched roofs, narrow dirt lanes, and the ever-present scent of livestock and hearth smoke. You are not a sheriff, a knight, or even a reeve. You are a cooper, a barrel maker, and like every villager, you are also something else, a reluctant watchman of the law. Because tonight you hear it, a shout in the dark, one word repeated with urgency, fear, and certainty. Thief. And then the echoing call that follows it through the hedgerows and cottages. Hue and cry, hue and cry. You drop your tools, you have no choice, the law demands it. What was the hue and cry? The hue and cry was not a law, but a legal obligation. First codified in the Assize of Clarendon in 1166 under King Henry II, it was one of the earliest forms of community-based policing in England. Any victim of a crime or any witness was legally required to raise an alarm. Upon hearing this, Every able-bodied man in the vicinity was expected to drop what he was doing and pursue the criminal with the same cry. To ignore it was a crime in itself. Failure to respond to a hue and cry could result in fines, public shaming, or worse. The logic was simple. In a kingdom without a standing police force, the people were the police. You, the cooper, are now a constable, if only for the night. How it worked. The process was strangely formal, despite its chaos. A crime is witnessed. Someone sees a theft, a fight, or a stranger committing an act against the king's peace. The shout begins. The cry is taken up. Others, whether in fields or at supper, repeat the cry, spreading it through the town. Pursuit begins. Armed with pitchforks, cudgels, or whatever is close at hand, men pour into the lanes, alleys, and forests, chasing the suspect. They may not know the criminal, but they must chase them all the same. The capture. If caught, the suspect is brought to the reeve or bailiff, who then delivers them to the sheriff at the next 100 court. Failure to catch the thief. If no arrest is made, the entire tithing a group of 10 households is held accountable. Fines are levied. Investigations may be launched. The system relied on fear and shame, not just law. No one wanted to be the village that failed to respond. Tithings, hundreds, and collective guilt. To understand hue and cry, you must also understand the social architecture of the law. Every man belonged to a tithing, a group of 10 men over the age of 12. These groups, in turn, were part of 100, a larger district often encompassing multiple villages. If one man in your tithing committed a crime and fled, the rest were responsible for reporting him. If they failed to do so, all would be fined. The system assumed guilt by association, and law by neighborly surveillance. If a stranger appeared in town and stayed more than a few days without being vouched for, the tithing could be punished. Strangers were always suspicious. Hospitality, while sacred, was also a legal risk. In this world, your neighbors weren't just fellow villagers. They were your insurance policy or your liability. A village without peace. Tonight, the hue and cry has been raised because someone has stolen a cow, a significant theft, equivalent to months of labor. You grab a torch and join the pursuit. Your neighbor Henry, a thatcher, is already in the lane, barefoot and breathing heavily. He nods grimly. They said he went toward the woods. You follow. You hear the others crashing through hedgerows, shouting the cry to alert others. Some are annoyed, others eager for excitement. All are fearful not of the thief, but of the consequences of inaction. Because if this man escapes and the reeve cannot name him, the 100 court will fine the village. The tax collector will not accept we didn't see him. You run faster. The legal weight of a cry. Raising a hue and cry falsely was itself a punishable offense. To cry thief when none was present could bring a penalty worse than theft, public flogging, or even branding. The system relied on trust and the assumption that anyone raising the cry would not do so lightly. Women could raise the hue and cry too, especially in cases of rape or assault, and by law, the community was still required to respond. Their voice carried the same legal authority in that moment. Once raised, the cry activated a legal mechanism. The reeve or constable would later record who had joined the chase, who had failed to appear, and what weapons were carried. Witnesses were required to testify, and if the thief was killed during the chase, a coroner had to be summoned to ensure the death was legal. Even justice had paperwork. And yet the system failed often. The hue and cry was based on assumptions, that people would act, that they could catch the criminal, and that justice would follow. In practice, it was flawed. Criminals fled across borders into other hundreds, where the hue and cry held no legal weight. Some villagers ignored the cry, confident they wouldn't be reported. Wealthier men sometimes paid others to run in their place or bribed the reeve to forget their absence. Worse still, false accusations often led to mob justice. Once the cry was raised, anyone fleeing was suspect. Foreigners, the poor, and the sick were easy scapegoats. There are records of travelers stoned to death by villagers after being mistaken for thieves, only to be found innocent later. But in a society obsessed with order and appearance, a dead man was better than a missing one. Justice in the forest. You and Henry reach the edge of the woods. Torches flicker against the mist. Someone up ahead shouts, "He's here." You burst through the underbrush to see a man crouched beside a tree, panting, mud-streaked, thin, desperate. A younger boy not from your village, a stranger. He holds no weapon. His hands are raised. Henry hesitates. "He's just a boy," he mutters. But others arrive and the decision is swift. Rope is produced. The boy is bound and marched back toward town, wordless. There will be no execution tonight. He will go before the reeve. But you already know how this will end. He has no tithing, no master, no one to vouch for him. The courts will assume guilt, and if they do, the villagers will ensure justice is done. Because if they don't, they all pay. Reflections on the hue and cry. The hue and cry was eventually replaced, centuries later, by justices of the peace, constables, and eventually modern police forces. But for nearly 300 years, it was the backbone of English criminal law. It was both simple and sophisticated, a social contract enforced by collective risk, not individual morality. You didn't chase the thief because you cared about the cow. You chased him because your livelihood depended on it. But what does it mean for a society when justice is a shared burden, and guilt is collective even in silence? What happens when someone chooses not to cry out? The sun rises over Nottinghamshire, revealing a village awakened not by roosters but by the muttering of uneasy neighbors. The boy, the suspected thief, has been locked in the reeve stable, bound at wrist and ankle with rough hemp rope. He has not spoken since his capture, nor has anyone offered him food. He will stand trial at the next 100 court, which meets once every few weeks. Until then, he must be held, and the entire village is now responsible for him. You and your tithing brothers are not just witnesses to this event, you are participants. And whether the boy is guilty or not, the law now binds you to a duty that is both civic and personal. Understanding the tithing system. In theory, the tithing was a kind of communal safety net. A group of 10 to 12 men, each pledging to monitor and guarantee the good conduct of the others. If one committed a crime, the others were expected to bring him to justice or face collective punishment. This wasn't optional. The origins of this system predate Norman rule, stretching back to Anglo-Saxon traditions of frithbore, or peace pledge. Under this system, men as young as 12 were entered into a tithing, often overseen by a tithingman, who acted as both leader and liaison to the reeve and 100 court. It was a system built not on surveillance, but on mutual suspicion and mutual accountability. Everyone was watching everyone else because if one failed, all paid. The guilt of inaction. The captured boy, now sleeping fitfully on a pile of hay, is not part of your tithing. In fact, no one can say where he is from. He claims he was heading south for winter work, a common enough tale. But he has no seal, no badge, no letter of passage. And more importantly, no tithing to vouch for him. The reeve, a grizzled man named Wulfric, gathers the tithing heads that morning. You attend with Henry and 8 others. The mood is grim. The law is clear, Wulfric says. If he escapes or dies before court, it falls on us. The 100 court will fine us 50 shillings. 50 shillings. To a villager, that is an impossible amount, more than a year's income for most. We'll take turns watching him, Wulfric continues. 2 at a time, day and night. Let no man slack or he'll answer to all. You don't argue, you can't afford to. This is the burden of collective justice. It makes cowards into guards and neighbors into wardens. Watch duty. Your turn comes just past dusk. You sit by the stable door, a cudgel in your lap. Henry sits beside you, carving a whistle from a branch more out of habit than comfort. The fire crackles low in the brazier. Inside, the boy is awake. "I didn't take the cow," he mutters. You say nothing. He speaks again, softer. "I was hungry. I took nothing, just walked through." Henry shifts. His knife stops carving. You know the truth doesn't matter much here. Unless someone from another tithing steps forward to claim him unlikely, he will be judged as a masterless man, a vagabond, and likely a thief by assumption. In the court's eyes, vagrancy itself is suspicious. Why wander unless you're fleeing something? But what no one likes to admit is this: there are more crimes in need of punishment than criminals to commit them. The role of the 100 Court. The 100 Court was the centerpiece of rural justice. Meeting every few weeks or months, it gathered landowners, reeves, tithing men, and sometimes sheriffs to settle both criminal and civil matters. Its job wasn't just to punish, but to restore order. In many cases, the court's role was to determine who owed what to whom: fines, restitution, livestock, or labor. When theft or violence was proven, punishments ranged from amputation, branding, or banishment, depending on the severity and the social status of the offender. If guilt could not be definitively proven, the accused might be required to undergo a trial by compurgation where others swore oaths on their behalf. But without a tithing or friends to vouch for you, compurgation was impossible. And that, in this case, would seal the boy's fate. The burden of oaths. The next morning, Wulfric assembles the tithing men again. He reads a list of names: those who were present at the hue and cry, those who touched the thief, and those who witnessed the supposed crime. All will be required to testify at the 100 Court. You are among them. An oath is no small thing in medieval law. Swearing falsely could bring spiritual and legal ruin. Perjury was a sin and a crime, and even if the truth was unclear, men were expected to testify with confidence. The system didn't demand certainty, it demanded assertion. If you say you saw the boy near the cow pen, even if you merely heard someone else say it, your words carry weight. The village needs someone to blame, and the reeve needs to demonstrate diligence. So who will speak up? A whisper of doubt. That evening, you visit Henry. He has been quiet since the chase. His wife says he hasn't eaten. You find him in the back garden, staring at the frost-covered ground. "He's just a boy," he says again. You nod. You saw him near the cow. Henry doesn't answer immediately. "I saw someone," he finally says. "It was dark, could have been anyone, but..." He trails off. "If I say that at court," he continues, "and he's freed, we'll all be blamed. The reeve will say we're soft, and Wulfric, never forgiven me for refusing his daughter's hand." He chuckles bitterly, but it's the truth. Justice here is personal. Reputation, grudges, alliances, these influence the law more than facts. If Henry refuses to support the charge, he may lose more than favor. He may lose protection. "So," you ask quietly. Henry shrugs. "So I'll say I saw him, that's safer." The court approaches. 2 days pass. The court is set to convene at the moot hill near the crossroads. The boy is pale but silent. No advocate has come for him. No tithing claims him. On the morning of the hearing, Wulfric gathers the tithing men again. "Speak as one," he instructs. "Say you saw him. Say he ran when challenged. Say nothing else." You nod, along with the others. Because if you don't, the burden may fall on you next. Collective justice, personal silence. The boy is found guilty. The 100 Court, acting under the view of frank pledge, the legal mechanism by which the tithing's word binds the community, orders him branded with a T on the forehead for theft. He is to be banished from the 100, never to return. A branding iron is heated. You do not watch. The boy does not cry out. He is marched away, head covered, led by 2 guards to the edge of the forest. He will likely die in the woods of cold, of animals, or of hunger. But your village is safe from the fine, and the reeve is pleased. Justice is done, he says. Aftermath. In the weeks that follow, life resumes its rhythm. Barrels are built, thatch is laid, animals are fed. But the burden remains, not legal but personal. You see it in Henry's eyes, in the silence at supper, in the way villagers avert their gaze when the stable is mentioned. The hue and cry brought the community together. But the truth that no one really knows what happened has pulled it quietly apart. What kind of justice exists when it is easier to believe the worst of a stranger than to question the comfort of one's own safety? And when your freedom is tied to the silence of others, how long before your name is the one shouted into the night? Winter settles over Nottinghamshire like a thick wool cloak. The fields lie fallow, the sheep huddle for warmth, and the hue and cry fades into memory. The branded boy has become a whispered reference, that lad who vanished in the woods, and the tithing no longer speaks of the trial. But justice in early England didn't rest with courts and punishments alone. It lived in the spaces between duty and doubt. It was written in absence what was not said, what was not seen, what was not challenged. You are a cooper still. You mend barrels, haul timber, and tend your small plot. And yet you feel yourself watching more now, listening differently, wondering where the law begins and where your responsibility ends. The quiet power of surveillance. The tithing system was built on more than formal oaths. It functioned through observation, not investigation. Your neighbors did not wait for proof. They watched for deviations, a tool missing, a cart parked strangely, a glance held too long. People who lived quietly, regular attendance at church, stable household, known routines were assumed to be good subjects. Strangers, travelers, those without known families or predictable movements, were regarded with suspicion. Even inside a tithing, internal watchfulness was constant. If a member came home drunk or injured, questions were asked. If someone went missing for a night, it was noted. If livestock were found dead, people remembered who had argued with whom the week before. The law did not require intent, it required compliance. You begin to understand that being lawful meant more than obeying commands. It meant shaping your life, so that no one had reason to cry your name. Tithing as a double-edged sword. At first, the idea of mutual responsibility feels like a shield. If you are wronged, your tithing must support you. If your ox is stolen, they help you recover it or at least provide witnesses. But the structure has cracks. When you express unease about the branding to Henry again, weeks later, he speaks more harshly than before. You'd rather we paid the fine. I'd rather we knew he was guilty, you reply. Henry shakes his head. That's not the point. He was alone, no tithing, no proof otherwise, that's guilt enough. His words echo a common medieval logic. In a world of collective responsibility, to be unclaimed is to be condemned. There is safety in structure. There is danger outside it. This is how the law maintained itself through fear of isolation, more than fear of punishment. When the cry returns. One morning in early spring, a commotion stirs near the edge of the village. A peddler's cart has been overturned. Bags of salt and dried fish are scattered. The peddler, a gray-bearded man from the next 100, is shouting. Robbed in daylight. The cry begins to rise. Hue and cry, hue and cry. You hesitate. It has been months since the last one, but the rules have not changed. You grab your cloak, your cudgel, and follow the shouts into the fields. Others run too, instinctively, driven by duty and fear of fine. You see figures moving along the tree line, just one, now disappearing behind a rise. He is too far to recognize, but the cry is enough. There he runs. But you slow, something pricks at your memory. The movement, the shape, the gait. It's the boy, or someone like him. He survived. A crisis of duty. The man, thin, fast, and clever, escapes again. The chase ends near a shallow stream. Footprints vanish into the mud. The peddler curses, but the reeve shrugs. No thief, no fine. But you linger by the trees, scanning the edge of the forest. A flash of gray, a hint of movement gone again. That evening you don't sleep well. Because in that moment, standing by the woods, you felt something rare. Not fear, not anger, but guilt. Not because you let the boy escape, but because you hoped he would. The law meets the landscape. Medieval justice was built around visibility. The hue and cry worked best in open villages, on plains, in clearings. It faltered in the forests, where strangers could vanish into shadow and where the king's peace grew thin. And it is here in the unseen places that justice often fails. You begin to wonder how many others live like that boy. How many masterless men move between towns, hopping not to be noticed. How many crimes go unpunished not out of innocence or escape, but out of collective silence. Because everyone knows, if you don't raise the hue and cry, you share in the crime. And so the cry becomes both sword and shield, a tool of justice and of cleansing. Speak it when convenient, ignore it when useful, and always pretend that silence is virtue. The Reeve's warning. Weeks later, Wulfric stops by your cottage. You've been quiet lately, he says. You nod. No calls for justice, you reply. He eyes you carefully. Or no crimes you've seen. The question is a threat, wrapped in politeness. You understand it. He's heard the rumors, the whisper that you saw someone in the woods and didn't shout. In a world ruled by oaths and silence, even perceived silence is dangerous. You deflect. I saw a shadow, could have been a fox. Wulfric nods, unsmiling. Be sure next time. Then he walks away. The shifting ground. Time moves on. The reeve is replaced. The court meets less often. New faces join your tithing. Some of the older men die. The boy's name is never spoken again. But something lingers. You now see the hue and cry differently. Not as a symbol of justice, but as a test of loyalty, of fear, of belonging. Because the cry isn't only about catching the guilty. It's about proving you are part of the world that punishes them. The hue and cry was among the earliest expressions of community law enforcement, a system that blurred the line between vigilance and violence, law and loyalty. Its power was not in its legal authority, but in the fear of being left out of it. When justice depends on the voice of the crowd, the greatest crime may not be theft or assault. It may be silence. But who speaks for the ones who cannot raise their voice? Who defends the ones no tithing will claim? And when the law demands action, what does it cost a person to look the other way? Story 3, Trial by Bread, the ordeals of innocence. You stand inside a timber-framed chapel, thick with incense and tension. A hush has fallen over the gathered villagers. At the altar, a loaf of dry barley bread rests on a cloth, simple and unremarkable. Except that today, it holds the weight of divine judgment. A man stands before it, his hands trembling, his lips pale. He is not accused of theft or murder or treason. He has been charged with something worse in the eyes of a small medieval community. Lying. He is about to undergo an ordeal, not by fire nor water, but by bread, a quiet, rarely spoken form of trial that tests not strength, but the very ability to swallow. This is the trial by Corsand. What was the trial by bread? In early medieval England, particularly between the 9th and 11th centuries, the ordeal was a common means of determining guilt or innocence when evidence was lacking and witnesses were few. Ordeals came in many forms. Ordeal by hot iron, where one carried a heated rod and had their wounds inspected for healing. Ordeal by water, where the accused was cast into a river. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence. Ordeal by fire or combat, in which strength was interpreted as divine approval. But among the most subtle and strangest was the ordeal of the coarsened, the swallowing of a dry, consecrated piece of bread, often accompanied by an oath of innocence. If the accused choked, turned pale, or convulsed, it was taken as a sign of guilt. If they swallowed calmly, they were judged innocent. It was as spiritual as it was legal, a test of body, yes, but more importantly, of conscience. Origins of the coarsened. The word coarsened comes from Old English cors, trial or judgment, and snad, bite or morsel. It may have originated with Anglo-Saxon customs, blending both Christian and pagan elements. The trial was reserved for specific types of accusations, especially those involving oaths broken, false witness, slander, suspected betrayal, where proof could not be found, and when the accused swore innocence, God himself was asked to intervene by lodging a dry crumb in a guilty throat. Clerics would bless the bread, invoking psalms or gospel verses as they did. Sometimes salt was added. The accused then consumed it alone, often kneeling in a holy place. And then everyone watched, because a simple swallow might damn or absolve. Setting the scene, a village dispute. In your village midway between Hereford and Worcester, a man named Edric has been accused by his cousin of defrauding him in a land claim. Both men are respected, both have tithings who support them. No one can say with certainty who speaks true. A court could not decide. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Written proof, if it ever existed, is lost or burned. So, as was customary, the local priest recommended the ordeal of coarsened. Let God judge what men cannot, he declared. The villagers agreed, reluctantly. Now Edric stands before the altar, his oath written, the bread ready. His cousin watches from the rear pew, expression tight. The process. The priest lifts the bread, murmuring Latin verses usually from Psalm 7. If I have done this and there is guilt on my hands, let the enemy pursue me and overtake me. He sprinkles holy water over the loaf, then he breaks it into 9 pieces. Edric must eat one with his hand on the gospel. He speaks his oath. If I speak false, may this bread become stone in my throat. A silence falls. He raises the piece, chews, and swallows. Or does he? A cough, dry at first, then more forceful, his face reddens. Someone gasps. The priest steps forward, but not to assist. He raises his hands. The verdict is already known. Guilty. The verdict's weight. The decision is final. The ordeal, in theory, is divinely guided. There will be no appeal. Edric loses his land claim. Worse, he becomes a social pariah, marked as one who lied under oath before God. His cousin reclaims the property. The village nods, reassured that the divine has spoken. But not everyone is convinced. The baker whispers that Edric had a throat ailment. A shepherd mutters that the priest favors the cousin's family. You recall seeing Edric drink little that morning. Yet none of that matters now, because the coarsened was never meant to be questioned. Faith or fear? Why would anyone agree to such a test? Simple, to refuse the ordeal was to admit guilt. And though the trial itself was spiritual, its outcomes were earthly: loss of property, shunning, even exile. For the falsely accused, it was a desperate gamble. For the truly guilty, it was a performance in hope of divine mercy or a calm enough throat. But the line between truth and confidence was perilously thin. You begin to see how fear itself may have played a role in choking Edric, not guilt, but terror. How many others, you wonder, lost everything not by verdict, but by a spasm of nerves? The coarsened as a reflection of society. This was a society where truth had weight, but only when proven by sacred rites. The ordeal was not simply a spectacle, it was a symbolic surrender of justice to higher powers. In an era where literacy was rare, courts unreliable, and witnesses often biased, the coarsened offered a strange sort of equality. All throats were mortal. It demanded that the accused place their body on the altar of judgment, and in that sense, it was no different than fire or water, only quieter. But even in its silence, it crushed lives. And then silence again. Edric leaves the village within days. His home is reclaimed. His name lingers in gossip, then fades. A few mention his case when other disputes arise, but the memory cools like ashes. The priest continues his duties. The villagers go back to their work. But one morning, someone notices the cousin has enlarged his field a little farther than the claim allowed. No one raises the issue. No one wants to be the next one, holding a dry crust in a trembling hand. The trial by bread, so strange, so simple, offers a unique glimpse into the medieval world's understanding of truth. Here, justice was not weighed by logic or law, but by trust in the invisible. A choke, a cough, a breath. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by war and kings, but by the smallest moments: a swallow, a stammer, a dry throat on a winter morning. But what does it mean when truth is measured not by facts, but by what our bodies will allow us to endure? And when fear can convict as easily as guilt? Who among us would dare to speak? The season shifts to early spring, and the tale of Edric, whose dry throat branded him a liar, has already begun to fade, as most rural scandals do. His land is tilled by another's plow. His cottage now bears a new thatch roof and a freshly painted door. But his trial by bread still lingers in whispered references and sidelong glances. This village, like many in medieval England, depends as much on certainty as on grain. And the ordeal of coarsened offered something rare in a world full of rumor and ambiguity: a verdict. And yet, not all agree with the priest's conclusion. Not all trust the fairness of a morsel. Not all believe the divine was listening that day. You are among those who wonder, and now, unexpectedly, you may soon face the same test. A new accusation. It begins with a small matter, a dispute over a boundary stone between your small field and that of your neighbor, Edwin. The stone has shifted only a few feet, but enough to mean several extra yards of barley. You're sure you've not moved it, and Edwin swears the same. But the reeve, weary from a long winter, doesn't want to investigate. He suggests without irony, "Take it to the church." That means one thing: an ordeal. At first you laugh, trial by bread over a stone, but Edwin nods eagerly. Let God judge. Now you are the accused, preparing for the ordeal. The process begins much the same as before. The priest, this time more solemn, arranges for the ordeal to take place after Sunday Mass. Word spreads quickly. You feel it in the glances at the well, in the hush as you enter the alehouse. They're not judging your guilt yet. They're wondering how well you'll swallow. You try to eat slowly at meals, practice chewing bread crusts, drink less to mimic a dry mouth, but you know it won't matter. Because on the day of the ordeal, everything will feel different. Psychological terror in a silent ritual. What most modern minds fail to understand about the coarsened is that it was not merely religious. It was performative, psychological, and biological. The bread was often dry and coarse, made from barley or rye, thickened with salt. The church was intentionally still, its acoustics amplifying the sound of every swallow or choke. The witnesses, dozens of neighbors, stared, silently waiting for a twitch, a cough, a hesitation. The priest's presence, invoking divine wrath, added an invisible weight to the tongue. The ordeal was, in many ways, a form of ritualized anxiety. The mind, under pressure, could easily betray the body. You learn this as the priest prepares the bread for you. He sprinkles it with holy water. He murmurs a prayer from Psalm 35. Let ruin overtake them by surprise. Let them fall into the pit they dug for me. You kneel before the altar. The moment of truth. You lift the crust. The villagers hold their breath. Edwin stands at the front, arms folded, face expressionless. You chew. The bread is drier than anything you've tasted. Each chew feels louder than the last. Your mouth is parched, your lips sticking slightly together. The piece begins to feel larger, as if it's expanding. You swallow. For one terrifying moment, the morsel lingers at the back of your throat. You focus, swallow again. It goes down. You exhale slightly, silently. The priest watches you. He waits, 10 heartbeats, 20. Then he speaks. The accused has swallowed without sign of guilt. The trial is over. You are innocent. Vindication and doubt. The villagers murmur their approval. Edwin shrugs, pretending not to care, though his wife's flushed face tells a different story. The reeve nods. The stone stays where it lies. But something has changed. Not in your standing, if anything, it has improved. What has changed is your understanding. You now see what Edric might have felt. You understand the loneliness of that moment, the crushing sense that one cough could rewrite your life. You were lucky. But what if you hadn't been? The hidden mechanics behind the divine. Later that week, you visit Father Aldhelm the priest. Out of curiosity, or perhaps quiet accusation, you ask, how does God know if a man is lying? The priest does not answer directly. He quotes scripture. Then, unexpectedly, he leans close. God speaks through the conscience, but the body hears it first. You wonder what he means. He does not explain. The decline of the coarsened. Though the ordeal of bread remained part of rural justice for generations, its use began to wane by the 12th century. Several factors contributed to this decline. Legal reform under Henry II and the emergence of jury trials made ordeals less central to justice. The Church itself, by the early 13th century, began to question the legitimacy of forcing divine will through physical acts. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council declared that clergy should no longer participate in ordeals, dealing a death blow to rituals like corsand. But in villages like yours, far from cathedrals and royal courts, the change came slowly. For many, the ordeal still felt fairer than court proceedings dominated by wealth, connections, or scribal trickery. After all, in a world where few could read, where documents were rare, and where judges were strangers, there was something comforting in the idea that God knew the truth, even if your throat didn't. Ordeals as moral spectacle. The corsand was not merely a tool for justice, it was a form of social reassurance. It allowed community to resolve disputes without civil war. It restored harmony through visible absolution or condemnation. It transferred the burden of proof to a divine entity no one could question. It was also a lesson. Each ordeal reminded the villagers, what you say matters, what you vow carries weight, and the truth may live in silence, but lies will always choke you. Whether or not you believed in the ritual, you believed in the result. That was enough. The trial by bread was quiet, brief, and deceptively mundane, but in its simplicity lay immense power. For those without status, without coin, and without written proof, it was often the only path to clear one's name. But what if your guilt or innocence was determined not by action, but by a moment of nervousness? What kind of justice rests on the cooperation of tongue and throat? And if God was truly watching, why did he sometimes remain silent? Years pass. You still tend your land. The boundary stone has not moved since the day you swallowed the holy bread in front of a chapel full of neighbors. But the moment chewing that coarse, salty crust, struggling to make it disappear into a dry and anxious throat, has never truly left you. You dream about it sometimes, not in fear exactly, but in a kind of suspended disbelief. Not because you doubted your innocence, but because you've never fully convinced yourself it wasn't luck or something else entirely that saved you. And in the quiet, when no one is watching, you begin to wonder if the bread ever judged anyone at all. The final Corsand, a case of clerical betrayal. The last recorded ordeal by Corsand in your region takes place not long after your own. But this time, the accused is not a farmer, nor a wanderer, nor a liar of minor means. It is a priest. Father Godric, a young clergyman stationed in a nearby manor, is accused by a wealthy reeve of embezzling grain tithe and falsifying account books no peasant could read, but whose missing bags of grain were felt by many. The accusation is serious. It reaches the ears of the archdeacon, but with no evidence, no confession, and with the priest himself refusing to stand down, the ordeal is proposed reluctantly by the church itself. Let the mouth that blesses the host be tested by it. The bishop is said to have winced when those words were uttered. A strange ceremony. Unlike previous trials, this ordeal is held not in a village chapel but in a cloistered priory, with clergy in attendance and a hush of unease that clings like fog. Father Godric kneels before the altar. He blesses his own bread, a conflict of interest, surely, and speaks his innocence with clarity and calm. He takes the bread. He chews. He swallows. He does not cough. But something strange happens. A minute later his face turns pale. His knees tremble. He vomits not violently, but enough to unsettle everyone. The monks argue. Some say it's merely nerves, others say it's a sign. The bishop, to avoid scandal, declares the ordeal inconclusive. Father Godric is quietly removed from his post. The grain is never recovered. No formal guilt is pronounced, but no innocence is claimed either. It is a death by implication, the same fate that awaits many in a justice system, where divine judgment sometimes stutters. When the ritual stops working, the people take notice, not just of Godric's disgrace, but of how poorly the ordeal functioned when applied to someone in power. In the months that follow, more voices begin to question the Corsand, not in open rebellion but in subtle jokes. Farmers say things like, "Careful, or you'll choke on your dinner like Father Godric." The ritual begins to lose its spell not because it was disproven, but because people saw its failure not to judge, but to protect. That is perhaps the most dangerous failure a system of justice can endure. Not that it is harsh, but that it is inconsistent. Juries and justice by men. In 1215, the same year the Magna Carta is signed, the Fourth Lateran Council forbids clergy from participating in ordeals of any kind. This is monumental. The Church, for centuries the very institution that gave legitimacy to such rituals, steps away quietly, ending centuries of spiritualized justice. In its place, the English legal system begins leaning more heavily into a new structure, the jury of one's peers. At first, these juries are not entirely neutral. They're drawn from the same community, with all the same biases, but they represent a shift. No longer must you swallow God's judgment. Now you must convince your neighbors. Some say this is more just, others say it is more dangerous, because people lie more easily than bread. Legacy of the Corsand. Though the ordeal of bread fades from official use, it lingers in memory, folklore, and metaphor. Even centuries later, English literature and law retain phrases like hard to swallow, choked by guilt, bread of affliction. These are not coincidences, they are echoes. Because Corsand was never just a trial. It was a symbol of truth rendered physical, of conscience made edible, of belief in something greater than man-made courts. Its end marks the passing of an age in which justice was entrusted to the divine, however ambiguously. What we learned from the bread. Now, years removed from your own ordeal, you sit beneath the old oak by your field, watching a new reeve survey property lines with parchment and ink. No more oaths, no more altars. Just contracts and seals. It seems cleaner. But you wonder, do the new ways feel truer? The bread was unfair. It punished the nervous and the ill. It rewarded the bold. It was wielded as a tool by those with social power. And yet it made the community stop, watch, listen. It gave gravity to an accusation, a finality to a dispute. It may not have judged correctly, but it made people believe. The final crumb. In your dreams now, you don't see the crowd or the altar. You only see the bread dry, salted, crumbling in your hand. You see your own lips, and you hear the silence of the moment just before you swallowed. The most profound justice may not come from punishment or verdict or ritual. It may come from that silence when all eyes are on you, when you know the truth, and when you alone decide whether to speak it or choke on it. The ordeal by Corson teaches us that history was shaped not only by battles and banners, but by a single bite of bread, chewed in fear, faith, or desperation. In a world that lacked evidence, it offered ritual certainty, however flawed, and its memory endures because it asked something simple, yet terrifying. If you were forced to put your truth in your mouth, would your body betray your soul? Story 4, The Pillory and the Public, Shamming as a Legal Tool. It's just past midday in the town square. The market is open, tables grown under wheels of cheese, baskets of turnips, pots of honey, bolts of wool. The smells of baking bread and sweat mingle in the early afternoon sun. But near the far end of the square, beneath a row of timber-framed buildings, stands something else. A wooden platform, 2 upright posts, a hinged board with 3 holes, 2 for hands, 1 for the head, and in it a man. His neck rests on splintered oak, his face flushed from exposure, his eyes cast down. He's been there since morning. By law, he will remain there until the bell tolls again. 4 hours of public shame for the crime of cheating a neighbor in a grain deal. Some people jeer, some throw fruit, others walk past in silence. One child stops and stares before being pulled away by her mother. Welcome to the world of the pillory. Shame as punishment. In the medieval and early modern periods, punishment wasn't just about pain or prison, it was about reputation, community standing, and the public theater of guilt. Unlike the dungeon or the fine, the pillory was a public display, designed to humiliate rather than cripple. Its purpose was not just to punish the wrongdoer, but to reinforce the values of the town, to remind onlookers what happened to those who betrayed their neighbors. The logic was simple. Let the people see. Let the people judge. Let the people remember. What exactly was the pillory? The pillory was a device of restraint and exposure. It usually consisted of a wooden frame mounted at chest or head height, 3 holes secured by a hinged board, 2 for the hands, 1 for the head. Sometimes a platform or step, so the prisoner could be displayed more visibly. When secured in place, the offender was unable to move, scratch, wipe sweat, or shield themselves from thrown objects. Some pillories had variations. The stocks, which restrained only the feet, were more common in rural areas. The jugs, used in Scotland, were iron collars attached to church walls. The cucking stool, used primarily for women accused of gossip or disorder, involved public dunking. But the pillory was unique in its urban symbolism. It was at the heart of the town, near the market, often beside the church. It was part of everyday life. Who ended up in the pillory? The list is long, but the most common offenses included selling bad bread or watered wine, cheating in weights and measures, perjury, libel or slander, public quarrels, breaking religious fasts, fraudulent trading, spreading false news. Importantly, violent criminals were rarely pilloried, their punishments were usually more severe. The pillory was reserved for crimes that damaged social trust. To be put in the pillory wasn't necessarily to be dangerous. It was to be dishonest, disruptive, or dishonorable. It wasn't just punishment. It was a statement. This person betrayed the community's unwritten code. The audience was the executioner. What made the pillory unique was that it relied on the public to complete the punishment. Magistrates set the duration, usually an hour to several, but the rest was up to the crowd. Sometimes the pillory was met with laughter, jeering, or playful scorn. Offenders might be pelted with rotten vegetables, dung, or mud. They might be mocked with rhyme or insult. But other times, especially when the crowd felt the crime deserved more, things turned ugly. Dead animals, stones, or iron scraps might be thrown. There are records of pilloried individuals blinded, disfigured, or even killed by mob violence. Magistrates could turn a blind eye, especially if the victim was already unpopular. In this way, the pillory was a legal sentence with variable intensity, determined not by law but by public temperament. You didn't just fear the punishment, you feared the people watching. A woman in the pillory. Later that week, another offender is sentenced to the pillory. Her name is Maud Fletcher, a widow accused of slandering the town's baker by claiming he patted his bread with sawdust. The baker's reputation suffered. She is convicted of public defamation. Her sentence is 2 hours. But Maud is not popular. She's outspoken, unmarried, and has previously argued with the reeve over a tax dispute. By the time she is locked into the pillory, a crowd has gathered. What starts as chuckles turns to shouting. What starts as mud becomes stones. One hits her cheek, another her shoulder. Her face is streaked with tears and blood, but the officials do not intervene. They do not look away. They wait until the bell tolls, then release her without comment. Maud walks home alone. Reputation and ruin. Maud's punishment is complete, but the damage lingers. She is no longer greeted at the well. Her goods are bought last or not at all. Children stare, neighbors whisper. This was always part of the pillory's power. The physical restraint ended, but the shame remained. Some people, especially those with money or connections, recovered quickly. But for the poor, the strange, or the already suspect, the pillory could be a lifelong sentence. Because a town does not forget your face when it has watched you humiliated. Punishment as performance. What we see in the pillory is not just justice, but theatrical justice. A public stage was constructed. An audience gathered. A central figure, guilty or not, was presented. The crowd delivered the emotional response. This ritual wasn't random. It was carefully timed, often to coincide with market days, religious festivals, or public feasts, ensuring maximum attendance. Sometimes, officials arranged musicians or town criers to announce the punishment. In France and Germany, offenders might wear inscribed placards around their necks detailing their crime. These details created a memory, something sticky, something lasting. A dangerous tool. The pillory wasn't always used for true justice. Over time, it became a tool for silencing critics, discrediting dissenters, and intimidating outsiders. In 17th century England, publishers and pamphleteers, especially those who opposed the crown, were often pilloried for sedition. In 18th century Paris, libertines and atheists found themselves on display beside beggars. In colonial America, Puritan towns used pillories for immoral behavior. which could include dancing on the Sabbath or criticizing a minister. Eventually, even the public began to tire of the spectacle. The rise of printed newspapers and criminal records created new forms of exposure. The idea of public shame evolved from a physical event to a social whisper. The pillory is gone now, torn down, replaced by benches, flower stalls, and town halls. But its echoes remain. We no longer stand on platforms, hands and heads trapped in wood, surrounded by a judgmental crowd. But we still shame. We still watch. We still point. Whether on street corners, court dockets, or town gossip, or, in modern times, on screens and comment threads, we continue to perform punishment, sometimes with more cruelty than the law ever intended. The pillory asked, what does a community do when it feels betrayed? But perhaps the deeper question is, when shame becomes a spectacle, who really is on display? The wood is cold in the morning, rough where hands have rubbed it for decades, smooth in the grooves where heads have rested unwillingly under the weight of accusation. You've never stood in the pillory, not yet, but today, you walk past it more slowly than usual, not because someone is locked inside, but because no one is. For the first time in weeks, it stands empty, idle, waiting. But its silence is not peace. It is a warning. The language of public punishment. The pillory spoke without words. It told you what mattered to your community: honor, fairness, trust. It also told you who mattered: the merchants whose trade depended on good reputation, the artisans who feared slander, the clergy whose moral authority needed protecting. A stolen purse might bring jail time. A broken window might bring a fine. But a spoken lie, a false weight, or a hidden hand on the scale, these brought the pillory. Because these crimes attacked the social fabric, not just property or people. The pillory, then, was the town's way of reasserting control, not by killing or maiming, but by making the offender visible, powerless before the eyes of everyone they had wronged. The legal process behind the pillory. Contrary to popular belief, being placed in the pillory was not arbitrary. In most towns, especially from the 13th century onward, it followed a process. Accusation. A neighbor or official lodged a complaint. This could be for fraud, defamation, or breaking trade laws. Inquiry or hearing. A town court or manorial court would convene. The accused might speak in their defense. Witnesses, often neighbors, testified. Verdict. If found guilty, sentencing varied by offense. The pillory was often reserved for repeat offenders or for crimes considered particularly offensive to communal trust. Execution of sentence. Pillory sessions were typically held during market days to ensure public visibility. These steps weren't always fair. Wealth, alliances, and prior reputation played major roles, but the structure gave the illusion of order, and order mattered more than truth. Customs and variations. The experience of the pillory varied depending on location, time, and offense. In some towns, offenders were forced to wear symbols of their crime, like a bag of fake coins for a forger, or a sign with their offense written out. In French towns, public readers might announce the crime aloud throughout the market. In Germany, the Schandmask or shame mask was sometimes added. Grotesque iron visors shaped like animal faces or exaggerations of the criminal's vice, e.g., a long tongue for a liar. In some cases, offenders had their ears nailed to the wooden board. If they tried to pull away too early, they tore their flesh. And yet the goal was not mutilation, but memory. The scar on your body was not as lasting as the scar on your name. When the crowd turns against the law, the pillory relied on communal participation, but this made it dangerously unpredictable. Some townspeople treated it as entertainment. Children threw stones. Traders jeered between sales. Apprentices took bets on how long a man would cry. Others, however, challenged the sentence, especially if they felt the punishment unjust. There are recorded cases of sympathetic crowds defending the pilloried, shielding them with cloaks, standing beside them, even feeding them sweetmeats and wine. Rioters breaking the pillory apart, releasing the accused by force. Judges abandoning the sentence when public anger turned on them instead. In 18th century London, Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, was pilloried for seditious libel. But instead of abuse, the crowd showered him with flowers and sang in support. This exposed the fundamental flaw of public punishment. It depended on consensus. When the crowd no longer believed in the guilt or the fairness, the spectacle failed. A story of sympathy. You recall, as a boy, witnessing a young woman named Tilda in the pillory. Accused of selling watered-down ale, she was a single mother struggling to feed 4 children. The town reeve sentenced her to 2 hours. But as she stood there red-faced, humiliated, no one threw a thing. In fact, some brought bread. A child gave her a blanket. A farmer whispered that he, too, had once stretched the ale with water when barley was scarce. By the time the bell tolled, Tilda was more pitied than punished. The reeve never used the pillory for ale fraud again. The unseen power of the crowd. This, too, was part of the pillory's function, not just punishment but feedback. It tested public mood. It exposed power imbalances. It allowed ordinary people to affirm or reject the law through applause or silence. The crowd, though technically passive, held the final word. Their reaction could validate the sentence or subvert it entirely. And this made the pillory both effective and dangerous for those in power. When it worked, it reaffirmed communal values. When it failed, it exposed how fragile those values truly were. When shame lingers longer than guilt. Maud Fletcher, the woman who stood pilloried for slander, never truly recovered. She continued to live in the village, but her stall in the market was often empty. Some claim she spoke less. Others say she spoke more, but only to herself. No law forbade her trade. No church condemned her. But the unofficial punishment, whispers, avoidance, mockery lasted far beyond the allotted hours in the pillory. This is what made the sentence so potent. It turned every villager into a long-term warden. Once you've seen someone made powerless, it's hard to see them any other way. The beginning of the end. By the late 1700s, the pillory began to vanish from English towns. Urbanization made crowd control harder. Enlightenment thinking questioned public spectacle as justice. New forms of punishment, prison, reform houses, transportation emerged as more civilized alternatives. In 1837, the pillory was officially abolished in England. But some forms of public shamming persisted even into the early 20th century, especially in rural areas or for military discipline. Even today, echoes remain. Mugshots published in newspapers, online exposure of wrongdoing, public apologies broadcast and dissected. We may no longer tie people in town squares, but we still watch. And we still remember. The pillory wasn't just wood and hinges. It was a mirror held up to a town, a nation, a culture asking, what do you value? Who deserves punishment? How long does shame last? When the law deputizes the crowd, it creates something powerful, but also dangerous. Because a crowd does not forget. And it rarely forgives. The pillory stands empty now. Its wood rots at the base, the iron bolts rusted, the platform warping under the weight of years of sun, rain, and silence. The crowds are gone. The market moved to a newer square. The bell that once rang to mark the start and end of punishments has long since cracked. And yet something lingers. You walk past it, now older than your father was when he stood beside it and jeered at a man for dishonest weights. You don't speak. No one does anymore. but everyone knows what it meant. And you remember how often the true punishment began after the bell stopped ringing. The unwritten sentence. Punishments like the pillory didn't end when the latch lifted and the crowd dispersed. In many ways, that's when they began. Tradespeople lost customers. Children stopped playing with a pilloried parent's child. Wives were pitied, then avoided. Men were passed over for guild membership. There was no formal exile, but life grew quiet. It was called social death, and it was one of the most feared consequences of public shame. Because the body heals, but the memory of guilt, especially witnessed guilt, sticks. When the law stumbled, sometimes the pillory punished the innocent. Sometimes it punished those who had committed no crime but had drawn the ire of powerful men or popular mobs. And once pilloried, even false accusation had weight. Consider a servant girl pilloried for slander, though later proven correct, remains branded in the minds of the villagers. A merchant wrongly accused of fraud never recovers his clientele. A priest wrongly defamed declines his next posting and disappears into quiet obscurity. The pillory was not just a sentence. It was a broadcast. And once a name is spoken in shame, it echoes longer than truth. Resistance and riot. There are stories mostly from cities of crowds rejecting the pillory altogether. In Bristol, 1750, a man known for generosity was sentenced for publishing anti-parliamentary pamphlets. When pilloried, the crowd formed a ring around him, blocking guards, shielding him with umbrellas from thrown debris. They passed bread and ale to him while jeering the authorities. In London, pillories became sites of protest. Banners waved, songs were sung, satirical plays performed in mockery of the sentences being carried out. Such acts revealed an uncomfortable truth. The pillory relied entirely on the crowd's cooperation. If the people chose sympathy, the punishment failed. If they chose silence, it became dangerous. This tension between law and people became too unstable to last. A shift in attitude. By the 18th century, Enlightenment ideals began to infiltrate the legal consciousness. Justice should be rehabilitative, not just retributive. Punishment should be private, consistent, and protected from mob excess. Pain and shame should serve society, not entertain it. The pillory, once a tool of moral instruction, became increasingly seen as barbaric, ineffective, and uncontrollable. In 1830, the last pillory punishment for libel was carried out in England. In 1837, it was abolished completely. The stocks survived a bit longer, mostly as a minor punishment in rural areas. But the pillory's age of public exposure and unpredictable shame was over. Or so it seemed. Modern pillories, shame in a new form. Although wooden boards and jeering crowds are now museum pieces, the logic of the pillory never left us. A mugshot posted online. A social media post gone viral. A misdeed real or alleged made public, followed by an avalanche of commentary, ridicule, and moral condemnation. The modern public square is not the market, but the screen. The stocks are not wood and iron, but search engines and share buttons. The key differences. There is often no due process. The crowd is larger, faster, and more permanent. The sentence is global and indefinite. And once again, the punishment is shaped not by the law, but by public mood. Sound familiar? Reputation and remembrance. Reputation in the medieval world was everything. It determined whether your grain was bought, whether your daughter married, whether your debts were forgiven, whether your oaths were believed. The pillory was a mechanism for policing that reputation. You didn't have to be liked, but you had to be trustworthy, and the pillory's purpose was to warn others that you were not. In that sense, it was as much for the future as the present. A man pilloried today might never be trusted again, even if his punishment was for a mistake or a single lapse. Just like today, when digital shame does not expire. The legacy we carry. You pause again at the old platform. Its base has collapsed on one side, grass growing where once townspeople spat. A few children play nearby, unaware of what it once was. It might soon be torn down. The Reeve wants to build a stage for public readings, a small symbol of how things have changed. But even as the wood disappears, you understand something. The instinct behind the pillory, the need to expose, correct, shame never vanished. It simply changed its medium. We still demand justice. We still crave the moment of public reckoning. We still draw lines between us and them. And even if the pillory is gone, we still build platforms. The pillory is more than an artifact. It is a question still whispered through time. Who gets to decide what shame looks like? Who wields it? And when shame is public and permanent, can justice ever truly be done? When punishment becomes performance, the audience becomes complicit. And whether in timber or text, pillory or post, the crowd still gathers. Story 5, Blood Price and Wergild, the economy of vengeance. The field is quiet this morning. Pale mist coils above the earth like breath. But in the thatched longhouse near the village border, the mood is far from still. A man is dead. He was struck in a quarrel, cut down with a hand axe in the middle of a dispute over a fence, a pig, or perhaps a field. The reason has already started to fade, but the consequence is clear. His body lies in the center of the hearth. His family gathers around, silent, angry, grieving. But they will not demand vengeance. Not yet. First, they will wait for the Wergild, the man price. Because in early medieval societies, before prisons and central courts, before kings claimed a monopoly on justice, the value of a human life was measured in coin. And that price had to be paid. What was Wergild? The term Wergild, also spelled Wergild or Wergeld, comes from Old English. Wer equals man or person. Gild equals payment or tribute. Together it literally meant man payment. Wergild was a system of compensatory justice, common among early Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and Norse societies, where crimes, especially killings, were settled by monetary compensation rather than blood. If a man was killed, the killer, or his kin group, owed a fixed sum to the victim's family. The goal was not punishment, it was preventing blood feuds. Because when one man died, his kin would seek justice. If no restitution was made, vengeance followed. The Wergild provided a way to stop the cycle before it began. An economy of lives. Wergild was not symbolic. It was detailed, structured, and deeply hierarchical. The value of the payment depended on the victim's social rank, their gender, their freedom status, free or enslaved, local customs and regional law codes. Some examples from 7th–9th century England. A nobleman might be worth 1,200 shillings. A freeman could be 200 shillings. A woman often had equal or higher value, depending on marital status. A thrall, enslaved person, had little or no Wergild, but compensation was owed to their master for lost property. In the laws of Ethelbert, Kent, c. 600 AD, we find one of the earliest examples. If a man kills another man, let him pay 100 shillings. If he kills a woman with child, let him pay 50 shillings. If he kills a servant of the king, let him pay full Wergild and 50 more. Every injury, every status had a price. Justice without prisons. The Wergild system existed before jails, before police, and often without a standing judiciary. It relied on collective responsibility. The killer was expected to report the death. The victim's kin would receive the payment. A local lord or moot court, A village assembly witnessed the agreement. If the killer fled or refused to pay, his entire family line could be held responsible. And if no payment came, the kin had the right to revenge, sometimes called the blood feud. Thus, Wergild was not mercy. It was balance, a quiet negotiation. In your village, the dead man's name was Leofric. The man who killed him is Oswald, his cousin by marriage. No one argues that Oswald struck the blow, but was it murder or manslaughter? The village moot meets to determine the price. The reeve speaks, so does the dead man's eldest brother. Oswald's father offers the first payment, 20 silver coins, as a gesture. The final amount, after days of talk, is settled at 200 shillings Leofric's full Wergild. It will be paid in 3 parts. 1/3 now, 1/3 after harvest, 1/3 within the year. Oswald remains in the village. There is no trial, no hanging. Just coin and waiting. Kinship and collective guilt. Wergild was rarely paid by the killer alone. The responsibility was shared by his kin group, usually defined as those within 4 generations on both maternal and paternal sides. This could include parents, siblings, cousins, uncles and aunts, even in-laws. These relatives were expected to contribute, not only financially but socially, attending meetings, swearing oaths, bearing witness. If they refused, they too could be ostracized or targeted. The system enforced collective moral responsibility, a reminder that a man was never just himself. He was his bloodline. And when he erred, all bore the stain. The risk of refusal. But what if the killer's family refused to pay? Then the system shifted. The victim's kin could declare a blood feud, legalized retaliation. This could be a single retaliatory killing, usually of the killer, a raid on the family's livestock or home, ongoing hostility until reparations were made. The community would often attempt to mediate, urging payment to avoid escalation. But in some cases, especially where the families were already rivals, feuds could last for generations, passed down like heirlooms. Blood demanded blood until coin replaced it. Women and the Wergild. Though women were not often in positions of power in the legal process, their Wergild was clearly defined and in many cases equal or higher than that of men. Why? Women were considered the bearers of future generations. A woman's marriage value, dowry rights, and childbearing role contributed to her assessed worth. Noble women, especially, carried high Wergilds. Killing one could destabilize family alliances. Some laws specified that a maiden had a higher Wergild than a widow. A pregnant woman's value could double. This was not equality in the modern sense, but it reflected a societal logic that a woman's life had measurable legal importance, at least on paper. Spiritual justice and Wergild. Over time, as Christianity took firmer hold in Anglo-Saxon England, the Wergild system began to incorporate spiritual considerations. The church encouraged forgiveness, but supported Wergild as a path to peace. In some cases, part of the Wergild was given to the church itself. Priests mediated disputes, particularly in cases where revenge threatened to spiral. Later law codes even referenced the soul. Let him who strikes the fatal blow make peace with God and man by gift and by gold. This marked a shift from Wergild as transaction to Wergild as penitence. But still the coin clinked the same. The fragility of peace. Leofric's family receives the first payment. They say little, but no violence follows. Oswald keeps his head down. He no longer walks near the mead hall. He no longer tends the field they once argued over. He is not forgiven, but he is tolerated. And for now, that is enough. Because peace, however awkward, is better than a cycle of death. Wergild was not justice in the way we understand it today. It did not ask why a crime occurred. It did not weigh motive or measure remorse. It simply said, a life is worth this much. Pay it or bleed. It was a system of survival, a compromise between vengeance and order. But what does it mean to assign a price to human life? Is it peace? Is it pragmatism? Or is it simply the cost of living in a world without forgiveness? Oswald pays the second portion of the Wergild just before the harvest. He arrives quietly, hands over the coin, and leaves without a word. The meeting is small but formal. The reeve records the payment. 2 elders bear witness. Leofric's eldest brother accepts the silver with a nod. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition that the system is being followed. Still, Oswald does not enter the mead hall. He does not smile at the market. He is not spoken to in the fields. Even now, as the legal agreement holds, the wound lingers in the village's memory. Because Wergild might end the need for vengeance, but it could not erase the presence of grief. Beyond murder, Wergild for wounds and injuries. Wergild wasn't reserved only for the dead. In many law codes, especially those from early Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish Salic law, a detailed tariff system was developed for non-fatal injuries. Nearly every part of the body had a value. Examples from the laws of Alfred and earlier. Cutting off a thumb, 20 shillings. Removing a big toe, 10 shillings. A broken rib, 3 shillings. Loss of an eye, 50 shillings. Cutting off the nose, 60 shillings. Striking a man so that he vomits, 1 shilling. Pulling out someone's beard, 5 shillings, and sometimes more for insult. These were not symbolic numbers. They were calculated based on the victim's ability to work, the social offense caused, the status of the body part. Yes, some were more valuable than others. Injury was treated like damage, to property being your own body. Insult as injury. And in many cases, words could carry price as well. Calling someone a coward or a thief without proof could result in fines. Public slander, especially against women, was serious. Even gestures like insulting hand signs or spitting had compensation rates. These payments were not Wergild in the strictest sense, but they followed the same logic: repair the damage done before violence erupts. In this way, the legal system was not just reactive, it was preventative. It understood that honor, in a world without police or privacy, was often more fragile than flesh. Children, elders, and special cases. Wergild applied to all free persons, but certain individuals had adjusted rates or special rules. Children had full Wergild if over a certain age, usually 12 or 14, but in some regions, half price before that age. Elders, depending on region and contribution to the community, could command higher compensation. Priests and monks often had inflated Wergild, not because they wielded power, but because harming one was an offense against God's peace. In contrast, serfs, slaves, and the unfree often had no Wergild at all. Their injury or death resulted in compensation to their owner, not their family. Justice here was deeply entangled with class and status. What if you couldn't pay? Sometimes, a killer or offender simply couldn't pay, whether due to poverty, exile, or unwilling kin. In such cases, alternatives existed. Enslavement. The guilty party might become a servant of the victim's family. Land forfeiture. Property might be ceded to cover the debt. Outlawry. The person was declared outside the law, no longer protected by community or king. Anyone could kill them without legal consequence. Outlawry was a social death sentence. It meant no protection, no food, no shelter, no justice. It was often a slow punishment: starvation, isolation, exposure. Wergild was not only about buying peace. It was a lifeline. Payment in kind. Though coins were ideal, wergild was often paid in kind, especially in rural communities. Cattle, sheep, grain, and weapons could be counted toward the total. Items were assessed by value, usually in the presence of witnesses. Sometimes work was used seasonal labor or multi-year service, documented by oath. This made the system accessible to a society where coin was rare and trust was local. It also reinforced the idea that debt was communal. Even if you didn't have silver, you had to give something. Reluctant payments, lasting divisions. Back in your village, Oswald's third and final payment draws near. Some want to be done with it. Others, especially Leofric's younger brother, argue that Oswald's presence alone dishonors the settlement. "We've taken his coin," he says, "but he walks like nothing happened." An elder replies, "He walks with shame, that's part of the payment too." This exchange reveals the fragility of the system. Wergild might end a feud in law, but not in spirit. Because money cannot unmake a death. Transition to royal control. As England became more centralized in the 10th and 11th centuries, the kings began to absorb the power of justice. Wergild shifted. More payments went to the king's court, rather than just the victim's family. Crimes were reframed as offenses against the king's peace, not just private disputes. Over time, the emphasis on monetary compensation declined, and punishments, fines, mutilation, imprisonment rose in its place. By the time of the Norman conquest, wergild had begun to fade, replaced by a feudal royal model of justice. But in villages like yours, custom endured. Because the law in London might declare a change. But in the thatched halls of kin and clan, tradition often ruled longer. The last payment. Oswald brings the final coins in person. He says nothing, but he lays them on the table in a linen pouch. The reeve nods, the agreement is fulfilled. Leofric's family accepts the payment, but only in silence. The law has spoken. But as Oswald leaves, you wonder, has peace truly returned? Or has a wound simply been covered with silver? Wergild was a system built not on mercy, but on balance. It turned violence into debt, and death into negotiation. It asked people to do something radical, to accept coin instead of vengeance. But could it truly settle the scales? Or was it simply a way of saying, let us live with what we cannot undo? The coin has been counted, the final pouch of silver delivered. Oswald, the man who took a life, has met every obligation under the wergild system. His kin have contributed, witnesses have been called, and the reeve has recorded the completion. By the old laws, justice is satisfied. But the village does not feel whole. There is no ceremony to mark the closure, no feast of reconciliation, no public forgiveness, just a shared unease like smoke that won't lift after a fire is doused. The question hangs silently in the minds of many. Was this justice? Or just a transaction? And now, from the wider kingdom, new winds are blowing, winds that will eventually sweep away the wergild altogether. The king's peace and the expansion of royal authority. As Anglo-Saxon England moved toward greater unification in the 9th–11th centuries, and even more so after the Norman conquest in 1066, the nature of justice began to shift fundamentally. Where once crime was a private affair, handled through kin-based negotiations and man payments, it gradually became the concern of the crown. No longer is murder merely an offense against the victim's kin, said the law codes of the late 10th century, but an affront to the peace of the king. This was not just a moral shift, it was a political maneuver. By claiming all violence as an attack on royal peace, the king inserted himself into every dispute. Every crime became a chance to enforce royal power. And the wergild began to fracture under that weight. From payment to punishment, Where Wergild once aimed at restoring balance, royal justice sought to deter crime through punishment. Gradually, crimes once settled with compensation began to result in fines paid to the crown rather than the family, corporal punishment, branding, mutilation, execution for serious offenses, imprisonment, especially as castle jails became more common. A man who once would have paid 200 shillings for a killing might now be hanged at the crossroads, with his property seized by the sheriff. The shift was slow, uneven, and resisted in many rural areas. But by the 12th century, Wergild was no longer the backbone of justice, it was a cultural memory. Legal codification and decline. The end of Wergild wasn't sudden, but we can trace its decline through specific legal developments. The Assize of Clarendon, 1166, under Henry II, created circuit justices, expanded trial by jury, and emphasized royal jurisdiction. The introduction of standardized fines and fixed penalties made local compensation systems increasingly obsolete. Common law began to override regional and customary practices. As literacy grew and written charters became more common, oral agreements and kin-based settlements lost power. The man price became not a settlement, but a relic. Survivals in custom. Despite official reforms, the logic of Wergild survived in certain customs well into the early modern period. Blood money or worm money continued to be offered, especially in remote communities, as a way to settle accidental deaths. In Scotland, composition payment to avoid a blood feud remained a feature of clan law into the 16th century. In Ireland, the Brehon laws continued a form of Wergild known as Iraic, where compensation was still the main goal of justice. And even in modern language, echoes linger. Paying one's debt to society, blood on your hands, making amends. Each of these phrases carries the weight of a life measured, a wrong made right through giving, rather than punishment alone. The ethical dilemma of Wergild. Was it a just system? It depends on your point of view. Strength. It prevented long-term bloodshed in an era without police or prisons. It treated justice as a social obligation, not a private revenge. It recognized the value of every person, at least within their class. Weaknesses. It was deeply hierarchical. Not all lives were valued equally. It allowed the wealthy to buy peace, while the poor often couldn't afford justice. It sometimes created lasting bitterness, especially when the guilty remained in the community. Ultimately, Wergild was a system of containment, not forgiveness. It didn't heal. It just settled the books. Legacy in modern law. Though long extinct, the principles of Wergild foreshadowed many modern legal ideas. Civil damages in wrongful death suits are modern echoes of man price. Restorative justice movements seek compensation and resolution over punishment. Victim compensation funds reflect the idea that harm must be repaired, not just punished. In these ways, the idea of repairing wrongs through value survives. But modern law is also wary of a world where justice can be bought. Because the question remains, if you can pay for a life, do you still carry its weight? Oswald's fate. Years pass. The payments are long completed. The reeve who oversaw the settlement has died. Leofric's younger brother has moved to another village. Few speak of the killing anymore. Oswald remains. He tills his land. He avoids the mead hall still. He marries quietly and raises 2 children. No one harms him. No one thanks him either. He paid his price, but whether he ever truly found peace only he knows. Some nights you see him alone by the field's edge, staring at the same spot where the quarrel began. The coins are gone. The memory is not. Wergild was more than a number. It was an idea. that a human life, though priceless, must have a price to prevent the world from tearing itself apart in cycles of revenge. It taught that justice could be made out of peace rather than pain. But it also asked us to put a value on something we say is beyond value. And so we must ask, can balance ever be bought? Or does every coin carry a shadow? Story 6, The Court of the Manor, Justice for Serfs and Slaves. The sun crests over the low hills, and a bell rings from the manor house. Its tone is not one of celebration, but of summons. Today is court day. You shuffle toward the manor's outer yard with the others men and women of the village, bent with work, wrapped in rough-spun wool. A small group already gathers under a weathered oak, where a low bench has been placed. Atop the bench sits no robed magistrate, no learned scholar, no noble judge trained in Latin. Just the Lord's steward, with a wax tablet, a worn expression, and a firm grasp of custom. This is the manorial court, a place of laws, punishments, and settlements. A place where even the poorest peasants and unfree serfs must answer. And where the most mundane details, fences, pigs, bread weights, scolding neighbors can carry the weight of justice. What was the manorial court? In the feudal structure of medieval Europe, particularly between the 11th and 15th centuries, land was divided among manors, each governed by a lord or his representative. The court baron and court leet were local judicial bodies presided over by the lord or steward, designed to resolve disputes between tenants, enforce agricultural rules and customs, punish minor crimes and moral failings, record land transfers and obligations. This system existed not for the sake of abstract justice, but to preserve manorial order, to ensure rent was paid, fields were worked, and the social hierarchy stayed intact. In a sense, the court existed to manage obedience. But for peasants and serfs, it was the only court they'd ever know. Who was judged? Everyone who lived on the manor, free tenants, villeins, bordars, and cotters, was subject to the court's jurisdiction. But it was the villeins and serfs, bound by service and blood to the land, who appeared most often. These individuals could not leave without permission, owed labor and dues, could be fined or punished for breaking custom, not just law. Yet paradoxically, they could also bring complaints, defend themselves, and even accuse their betters, provided they had witness and standing. The manorial court was restrictive, but it was also a rare place where a serf could speak against injustice. A morning on the bench. Today's role begins with a land dispute. Robert of the Mill claims that Henry's new fence crosses the path to the river. The steward hears both men. Witnesses speak. It is revealed that the fence does indeed block the path, but it was built after the river flooded last spring. The decision. Henry is ordered to move the fence. Robert is fined 2 pence for cutting through a hedge in retaliation. Next comes Alice, a widow accused of baking underweight loaves, a serious offense, as bread was both staple and symbol. Her loaves are weighed, 2 are light. A fine of 4 pence, and no baking for market until next court. Alice bows her head. It could have been worse. Serfdom and law. Though serfs were unfree, they were not lawless. The court regulated even the smallest aspects of their lives. Marriages, permission and payment were often required. Inheritance, subject to lordly approval. Fines for brewing ale without license, failing to weed properly, letting pigs roam. Punishments varied. Fines were most common. Public penance, such as standing barefoot before the court, was not unusual. Stocks or the pillory for theft or disrespect. Temporary expulsion or increased labor, dues for repeat offenses. Yet physical punishment was rare. Why? Because serfs were valuable labor. A broken serf does not harvest wheat. The steward in the court role. The steward wielded enormous authority. He called the court, usually every 3 weeks. Recorded decisions in the court roll, a parchment or ledger listing each case. Interpreted custom. Issued fines. Represented the Lord's interests. Court rolls from surviving manors, like Wakefield or St. Albans, show an astounding array of detail. John, son of Walter, let his pig stray into barley fine, 3 pence. Emma of Holt brewed ale too strong fine, 1 penny. Agnes, wife of Richard, slandered Joan Baker, ordered to apologize. 2 boys caught playing dice on holy day warned and fined. These records remind us, the court did not merely punish, it preserved the memory of the manor. Appealing upward, rarely. Could a peasant appeal beyond the manor? In theory, yes, to the 100 court or king's justices. In practice, almost never. Travel was difficult and expensive. Royal courts were remote and slow. Appeals were viewed with suspicion. Why trouble the king with pig fences? Even free peasants were discouraged from looking beyond the manor. The manorial court was not built for justice in a higher sense. It was built for containment, to solve disputes before they left the estate. Voices from below. Despite its rigidity, the court allowed some surprising acts of resistance. Tenants could collectively refuse dues, prompting negotiation. Women, especially widows, often represented themselves with confidence and legal acumen. Neighboring families formed alliances to influence verdicts. Some even memorized the court rolls to catch stewards in error. One famous case, from the 14th century court rolls of Halzowen, shows a serf named Beatrice who brought charges of sexual assault against a reeve. She lost, but the complaint was heard, recorded, and argued. This was more than symbolic. It meant the unfree had voice, however limited. Back at the court. By midday, the final cases are heard. A scolding match between 2 women over a goat. A young man fined for singing lewd songs during a festival. A boy punished for skipping his weeding duty. The steward rises. Let all who owe labor present themselves at dawn tomorrow. Let all fines be paid by sunset. The bell rings again. The court disperses. No applause, no celebration, just nods and murmurs. Another session of low, grinding order. But for the people of the manor, this small bench beneath a tree, this steward's ledger, these whispered verdicts. This is the law. The manorial court was humble, limited, and often deeply unfair. But for centuries, it was the only legal framework that most people in Europe ever knew. It handled their births and marriages. It punished their quarrels and mistakes. It recorded their obligations and grievances. It was not justice in an abstract sense. It was justice for the bound, the poor, the rural, the forgotten. A rough sort of order. In a rougher world. The morning dew still clings to the grass when you return to the manor for the next court session. This time, you're not a spectator. You've been summoned. The reason? A dispute over a boundary stone at the edge of your small croft, a stone you didn't move, but that your neighbor swears was rolled 3 paces in the night. You feel the weight of that accusation more than you'd like to admit, because here, in the court of the manor, truth isn't just told, it's sworn. And once you've sworn your innocence or guilt, there's no going back. This is not just a gathering of villagers. This is a ritual. The ritual nature of manorial justice. Manorial court proceedings were more than legal mechanisms, they were performances of authority. Each session followed customary rhythms, with the court crier announcing proceedings, the dozen jurors or homage, tenants chosen to assess disputes, seated at the front, the lord or steward presiding with an authoritative presence, the court roll in hand, a living document of record and memory. These sessions were public events, part governance, part theater. They demonstrated the Lord's sovereignty, not only over land but over time, truth, and memory. Sworn testimony, Oath over evidence. In the absence of documents or forensic evidence, truth in the manorial court was sworn, not proved. The most common practice was the compurgation oath, a formal declaration of innocence or claim, often supported by oath helpers. For example, if accused of trespassing, you might swear you hadn't entered the land in question. You would bring neighbors to swear alongside you, attesting to your character and honesty. The court would then decide based on custom, consistency, and reputation. If the oaths were accepted, you were cleared. If not, you were fined or worse. The oath was binding, sacred, and dangerous to swear falsely. To break it was to risk social and spiritual ruin. Because in the eyes of the manor, your word was your worth. The homage, peasants as jurors. Every manor had a group known as the homage tenants, often 12, who served as jurors, witnesses, and enforcers of custom. They were expected to attend every court session, report local offenses, failing to do so risked fines, help resolve disputes, support or challenge oaths. This duty was both an honor and a burden. It gave peasants a role in governance, but it also tied them to the lord's legal apparatus. Refusal to serve or lying while on homage was a punishable offense. In this way, justice was communal and often so was guilt. Common offenses and their consequences. The manorial court didn't deal with murder or high treason. That was the king's business. Instead, it regulated the daily grind of peasant life, including failure to work during harvest, a serious offense, improper weeding, planting, or grazing, unauthorized marriages or movement, serfs needed permission to wed or leave, illegal brewing or baking for sale, moral offenses, adultery, public drunkenness, lewdness, unlicensed gatherings or dances, which often resulted in pregnancies and fights. Punishments were tailored to status. For freeholders, fines, occasional land loss. For villeins and serfs, fines, increased dues, labor penalties, rarely corporal punishment. The worst penalty, short of banishment, was being recorded as a persistent breaker of custom, a scarlet letter in the court rolls. Justice as management, not fairness. The goal of manorial justice was not philosophical fairness. It was maintaining productivity, preventing escalation, enforcing custom, protecting the lord's economic interests. So while the court sometimes sided with peasants against stewards or reeves, it usually acted to reinforce the expected order. It didn't ask, "Is this just?" It asked, "Will this keep the peace and the grain growing?" Disputes between serfs, a case study. Let's return to your dispute over the boundary stone. At court, you're called forward. You swear the stone has not been moved. Your neighbor, Thomas, insists otherwise. Both of you have lived on the manor since birth. Both are villeins. No one saw the stone being moved. You present your two oath helpers, John, your cousin, and Edith, your wife's aunt. They swear on your behalf. Thomas has 3 supporters. 2 are part of the homage. The steward listens, squints, and announces, "The court finds for Thomas. The stone shall be returned to its former place. You shall pay a fine of 4 pence and a day of labor to the reeve." You nod, you say nothing. Justice, maybe. But more importantly, the court has spoken, and the matter is done. The moral policing of the manor. Beyond field work and boundaries, the court also upheld social and religious norms, especially during and after the 13th century. Public drunkenness on holy days, gossip that caused unrest, blasphemous speech or neglect of church attendance, bastardy or sexual misconduct, often targeting women. Punishments for these were often ritualistic. Carrying a stone through the village, standing barefoot at church door, wearing a sign declaring your offense, sitting at the court entrance in silence. These were acts of shamming, designed to remind everyone, you live within the eye of the manor. Women before the court. Though women had limited power in the broader medieval legal world, the manorial court heard and judged women frequently. Widows defended land rights. Wives accused other women of slander or seduction. Alewives were regular defendants and complainants for improper brewing. Women often served as witnesses, especially in moral disputes. The court did not see women as legal equals, but it did hear them. And that made it, paradoxically, a more accessible space than royal or ecclesiastical courts. A world of bound custom. As you walk home from court, fined and frustrated, you pass the field where the boundary stone now sits. You think of how many times this path has changed, and how many others have stood before the steward, swearing truth or guilt or both. The court is not just a room or a bench. It's a memory device, a way to ensure that everyone knows their place. Some may chafe at its rulings, some may find solace, but none can ignore it. Because on the manor, law is not a shield. It's a net, and all of you are caught inside it. The manorial court was a world of oaths and order, custom and constraint. It offered a voice to the bound and the poor, but only within carefully drawn lines. It was not a courtroom as we think of one today. It was a field where power whispered through hedgerows, where justice meant balance, and where a stone moved 3 paces could mean 4 pence and a day of labor. But perhaps the more interesting question is, in a world without freedom, is obedience the same as justice? The court convenes less often now. Years have passed, and with them some of the old rhythms have faded. The steward is older, slower with the court roll. Fewer tenants attend each session. Some disputes go unrecorded. Fines are still levied but rarely enforced with the same bite. You notice it gradually. There are more coins in the hands of villagers now, more goods passing to market beyond the manor's borders. Travelers speak of towns where freemen gather, where royal law reaches even the smallest hamlets. The world is changing, and with it, the manorial court is beginning to die. The decline of the manorial court. By the late 14th and into the 15th century, the importance and influence of manorial courts began to weaken across England and much of Western Europe. There wasn't a single cause but a tide of change, driven by 1. The Black Death, 1347–1351. The plague killed up to half the population in many areas. With fewer peasants to work the land, labor became scarce and thus more valuable. Lords struggled to enforce traditional services. Serfs gained bargaining power. Many abandoned manors altogether for better conditions elsewhere. The manorial system, built on the assumption of abundant and obedient labor, began to crumble. 2. The rise of a money economy. Coin became more common, replacing labor services and kind-based payments. Rents were increasingly paid in cash, not days of plowing or carrying grain. Disputes over fieldwork became less frequent, and thus less central to court sessions. Courts that once enforced harvesting schedule now tracked leases and sales. As money replaced mutual obligation, the need for custom enforcement shrank. 3. Legal centralization. Royal courts expanded their reach. Royal justices traveled more widely. Written law gained prestige over local custom. Appeals to chancery or common law courts grew. The king's justice, once distant and abstract, now offered alternatives to manorial control, especially for the rising class of freed peasants. The rise of the yeoman and the fall of the villein. As labor shortages empowered the rural poor, many villeins and serfs purchased their freedom or were manumitted. The yeoman class, small landowners with legal freedom, grew in size and influence. They no longer needed the manorial court to settle disputes. They could bring cases before local justices of the peace. They had the literacy and money to navigate royal charters and contracts. They formed guilds and associations outside the feudal framework. For them, the old manorial court became an anachronism, a relic of a bound past. What became of the manorial court? By the 16th century, most manorial courts had been reduced to symbolic function. Some remained only to record land transfers, enforce rare local bylaws, serve as ceremonial institutions. A few persisted in form, especially in large or isolated estates, but their teeth were gone. The court of the manor, once the stage for oaths, obedience, and communal justice, became a memory kept in rolls and parchments. Yet even in their twilight, these courts left an enduring legacy. Legacy in law and language. The manorial court system helped shape 1. The jury system. The homage made of neighbors was an early precursor to modern juries. They combined knowledge of custom, reputation, and behavior. Later royal courts adopted and formalized this into trial by jury. 2. Local governance. Courtleets, offshoots of manorial courts, laid foundations for parish councils. The management of communal resources, roads, bridges, markets persisted in local government structures. 3. Legal records. Court rolls became vital historical documents, tracking life and law for centuries. They offer modern scholars insights into gender roles, class conflict, and rural economics. 4. Cultural memory. The court lived on in idioms, held to account, sworn testimony, by common law, bound by custom. Each of these echoes a world where justice was not blind, it watched from the fields. Freedom and its limits. By the 17th century, most peasants were legally free, but new challenges replaced the old. Enclosure of common lands stripped many of their ability to survive independently. Wage labor introduced new kinds of dependency. Courts became more formal and less accessible to the poor. For all its flaws, the manorial court had one peculiar virtue. It was intimate. You knew the steward. You knew the accuser. You knew the rules even if they hurt you. The royal courts, by contrast, were cold and distant, even if more fair in theory. Freedom came at the cost of familiarity. The last session. In your village, the steward no longer calls court every 3 weeks. Once a season, perhaps, he gathers a few tenants to register a land lease or note a boundary dispute. The homage no longer swears in full. Oaths are brief. The crowd is small. One spring, the steward does not call court at all. You wonder if he's simply forgotten, or if it no longer matters. You still tend your plot. You still watch the paths and the fences. But there is no bench under the oak, no crier's voice, no wax tablets bearing your name. And though you are now, legally, free, you feel something is missing. Who decides now when your neighbor's pig tramples your barley? Who bears witness when the stone is moved again? The manorial court was never grand. It judged no kings, it weighed no crowns, it settled no matters of state. And yet it shaped the daily lives of millions. It governed who owed eggs, who could wed, who could speak. It etched the rhythms of obligation into the soil itself. Its justice was flawed, bound by status, custom, and power. But in its absence, we may ask, when justice is no longer spoken beneath trees or whispered in fields, do we hear it more clearly? Or has something quietly been lost?